Hello, are you guys with me? Okay. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event. My name is Jennifer and I'm the marketing director here at Analytics 8. If you are new here, Analytics 8 is a data and analytics consulting company, and our consultants specialize in the entire data and analytics lifecycle from strategy through implementation. Today, our panel is going to be discussing the data topics and trends that we feel companies should be paying attention to this year to get more value from their data. We want this to be an interactive event, so please, if you have any questions along the way, drop them into the chat. We are also going to be providing some additional resources for you all within the chat. And at the end, we are going to do a little trivia with a giveaway, so stay tuned for that. Our panel today is a powerful lineup of data experts with deep experience in the industry, and I'm super excited to hear what they have to say. On the screen, we have Patrick Vinton, Tony Dolliger, Christina Salmi, Kevin Lobo, and our special guest today, Kate Strachnyi, who will be moderating our discussion. And I will hand it over to you, Kate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. It is an honor to get to co-host this Navigating the Data Landscape for 2023 session with Analytics 8. I was so excited. I even got a balloon with an 8 on it just to make it more Analytics 8-y. And I really can't wait to hear what everybody has to say on this topic. I do want to reiterate what you said. This is an interactive session. So for the audience that has tuned in live, if you have questions or comments, if you're agreeing or disagreeing with what we're talking about, put that in the chat. I think it's a great opportunity to not only learn from each other, but also to network. So I spend quite a bit of my personal time on LinkedIn, scrolling through and talking to experts in this space. And I can agree that the 5 trends that Analytics 8 has selected are the key trends that we need to be discussing. We're going to talk about data literacy, data products, data mesh, event-driven architecture, and industrialized machine learning. And as Jen said, we're going to close out with some fun trivia and a giveaway. So really excited about that. I think this is going to be a great session. And as we kick things off, I just want to know, how did you guys agree on the top 5 trends that we're going to talk about?
Well, it was hard. Go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I was going to say, we'll just suffice to say it was a little bit of a challenge. And actually, I think ultimately we didn't totally agree. I think some of the stuff we talked about were compromises. We thought this was, we also thought there were several other important things that have a lot of momentum now in the industry. And so hopefully if there's time at the end, we can talk about some of those too. But yeah, there's a lot going on, a lot of exciting things. And it was a fun process.
Absolutely. I think it's good when you don't all agree at the same time in the beginning, right? So you all come together and find a solution after. I think a great place for us to start is, from all those 5 trends, is probably data literacy. And data literacy, it's the ability to understand, work with, interpret, and communicate with data in a meaningful way. And I think a good place for us to begin this conversation is, Christina, tell us, how important is it for everyone in the company to understand data, not just the data specific roles, but I mean like everyone in the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of funny when we look back at how companies overall have just evolved and matured over the years, because maybe 10 years ago, we had to explain to companies the value and importance of investing in data. And now it's kind of the opposite. Like, everybody feels like they have to keep up with the Joneses and have some sort of data warehouse or something, but they're missing that last piece and that last connection. So to answer that question, kind of think back to, what is the original point of having data at all? I mean, the point of having data, the point of massaging it, the point of having all these really great technologies is that we can use it and harness the insights in that data to make a difference in the business and in the business outcomes. And what we're seeing, there's lots of statistics out there, all of them kind of vary, but most of them are like, like less than 20% of people feel like they are data literate or are seeing the business outcomes, whereas like 80% of companies are feeling like they know it's important. So there's that gap that's there, and there's lots of ways that we could address that gap, but data literacy is one of the hot topics for this year, that companies are realizing that they are doing a lot of the right things, but they're missing kind of like that last step. And that last step isn't just the folks at the organization who use data, it's everyone. It's the business who needs to know how to interpret that data and then translate that into a business decision that they can make with, from an informed perspective, not just from like a gut feeling.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned the fact that companies are realizing that this is important. Everyone needs to be data literate. Have you seen a similar sentiment from the employees, let's say the non-data specific roles? Are they sort of raising their hands now and saying, hey, I want to be data literate. I want to do this too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing that in a couple different ways. One is the demand for ad hoc reporting. So, the businesses and different departments saying, they're happy with some of the dashboards that IT might be providing them, but this need and desire to have access to the data, which then also drives that desire to know how to use that tool and what to do with the information that's there.
Yeah, you said ad hoc reporting. I saw something funny online recently where it was a meme of like, is it really self-service if you need a team of 5 people to actually like walk you through how to use the tool, how to get the data in? I think we're moving towards that, but I can definitely see people getting more excited about the topic and realizing some of the benefits, like career benefits. I'd love to talk about that as well. Do you see substantial, tangible benefits for an individual who, let's say, is not in a data role and decides to become more data literate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for one, it's the direction that everyone's going in. So to make yourself more marketable, to increase your value at this organization or at others, I think more and more people are recognizing that it's important. And with just the increase in accessibility to data that we didn't have before. So like the data is there, there's so many great resources online. You can, learn on your own how to interpret all this, great information that's at your fingertips, and just kind of to know what to do with it, and then how to translate that into doing your job better. So like it's like the answers are there for you, and you can, you can find ways to enable yourself to improve your, whatever job position you're in, whatever industry. There's always a way to harness data insights to improve.
Yes, absolutely. And I see Charlene here had a question. She asked to reiterate the data literacy definition. Now, I provided a very simple definition of read, write, understand, create with data. Do you have a better definition that can, provide more insight into what is data literacy?
Yeah, and there's varying definitions out there. I mean, that's at the core, right? Being able to read, understand, interpret, communicate. Data visualizations can be such a powerful tool to communicate to others the importance of doing something or the importance of taking a certain business path. But another variation on that definition also includes kind of more of the cultural change. So not just knowing how to use the data, but having that enthusiasm or desire to use the data, to use the new technologies and incorporate it in. And that can be hard sometimes, especially, I mean, people have been doing things certain ways for years, so to just take that chance and embrace the change to improve is, that's the first step.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel as well. Does everyone in the company need to be at the same level of data literacy? Do we all need to understand how to read, write, and create data visualizations? Or are there specific roles and criteria for having to know, like, I'm the most data literate, or I'm a little bit data literate? Is there a continuum, or where do we all want to be?
Yeah, there's certainly a continuum. One thing I'll say, I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm going to kind of leave that to some of the others on the panel to point out. But one thing that I think when we talk about data literacy is making sure you're not over self-judging where you are on the curve. There is definitely a spectrum, but it's in any profession, it's a little bit dangerous to think that you are actually more savvy than you actually are. Hey, I saw this YouTube video, I can work on an airplane. Well, maybe that's not a good idea to do that. It's typically not a life or death situation when we're talking about data literacy, but you can often find yourself in a situation where you're making ill-defined business decisions, thinking that you're literacy than it is.
It could be life and death, right? Depending on which data you're working with. If you're working in a hospital and you say, I know how to do this, this chart says do that. And yeah, that could be like that. So it could be dangerous, but I agree for the most part, it's not as dangerous, but we all need to level up, I think, in a company. And I guess the last question I'd have here on data literacy is, what can companies that are listening in right now, what can they actually do to help all of their employees go at least one step up in their data literacy levels this year?
Before we do that too, so one of the most important parts of data literacy actually has nothing to do with like your ability to read a chart or like understand statistical analysis. Like the first step is understanding where the data came from, like how it was collected, what kind of error rate there might be in those processes, like the quality of the data, who you can talk to when you have questions. Like data literacy doesn't have to start with from a technical perspective, but can be mostly focused on understanding like data is a representation of something that happened in the real world. Yeah. And anytime you represent something, like you're going to have bias in that, you're going to have potentially error. It's going to be not a perfect picture necessarily of what happened. So the easiest place to start with data literacy is making it very accessible to people in an organization, very clear and transparent, like where it came from, who created it. If we know there are issues, like how do we actually publicly say, hey, this data set could have errors? We all experienced the effects of that over the last few years as everybody in our society all of a sudden became data literacy experts with a certain data set for public health. But like that's part of it. We all kind of learned that the hard way over the last couple of years, but the same is true for organizational data, sometimes more so because, you know, our processes are imperfect and things like that. So you don't have to be like, I have to go take a LinkedIn course necessarily to like become more data literate. That could be one place you want to go.
Yeah.
But an easier place to start is just understanding like more about the data itself.
Yeah, I guess a good place to start is the data you're actually working with and making sure you have an understanding of, like you said, where it's come from. Is it accurate? If we have errors, what's the protocol of raising your hand and saying we have errors? I'm assuming in a lot of companies, it's not that simple, because then it's the blame game of who created those errors. But I guess that leads into having a more data-driven culture where data is respected, treated as an asset, and valued as such. And this leads us very nicely into the next topic, which is all around data products. And quick description here. So it's a mindset where data is viewed and treated as a valuable product that can deliver tangible value to consumers through an organization. So Tony, let's start with, what are data products?
So the term data product is a buzzword and it's been co-opted to mean a bunch of different things. Some people say that for something to be a data product, it has to originate from like a domain-oriented team. Or other people, when they use the word data product, they're talking about something that an organization can actually monetize to market, like producing some kind of data-oriented product that you can sell. Mm-hmm. I think those are actually subsets of the bigger concept. To me, when I say data product, I think the most helpful way to think about data products is more about the mindset you use when you actually create or provide data to others. It can be internally, it can be externally, but ultimately, like, I try to take a much more pragmatic view that a data product is the result of a product-oriented mindset where you are trying to satisfy the needs of your consumer. So if you're thinking about like what we just talked about with data literacy,
right?
You have people who want to be able to use data themselves. If you're creating a data product, your objective basically is to say, what are all the things I can do from a technical perspective to meet people more than halfway, to not ask them to have to like go figure out all the different things that they need to be able to use that data, but how can I provide a complete package to people when I present data to them where it meets where they're at from a literacy perspective. And at the end of the day, like, data products is really about thinking about what you're creating from the consumer's mindset. And
I think it would be
the variation of how that applies can be, you might have machine learning algorithm that needs it as your consumer. It's very different, right? So it can be very broad spectrum of that, but ultimately it's just thinking about things from the consumer's perspective first.
Right. So it's that mindset shift really of thinking about the consumer and how we're actually delivering data as that product. Do you have a couple of like concrete examples of maybe companies using data as a product, and so the audience can really drive home the point of what does that mindset actually look like?
Yeah. Any application or solution that a company creates that's well adopted within that organization, whether or not they intended it to be a data product or not, ultimately is a successful data product. So like, this is not a new concept. It's not something, I mean, it is a new term, but like what you're really saying is like, this is something that's getting used. Right. We're delighting our consumers. We're getting feedback from people. And it's clear to the consumer, like if I have an issue, I know who I can talk to be able to adapt that product. So like we have a customer who Kevin and I worked with years ago, who had this data set, was really interesting, needed to go out to the whole organization. And honestly, I didn't think twice about it because I thought, yeah, this is interesting data, but sometimes you're surprised on what people actually need to be able to do their job and things they find interesting. So we created this app basically for them that presented this data visually to them. It was geographic data. So we put it in a map so they could look at it like actually in a map with their territories and everything. Right. And it became like the most used product they had in the organization. It became a standalone thing. It had its own server almost because the usage was so high back when we had servers and stuff. But like at the end of the day, like the whole point of that, it became a data product in and of itself. Like it became an entity to be managed in and of itself like a product because people had a high amount of demand for it and were using it. There's all kinds of other products you create that don't get used and they should get discarded in the marketplace like anything else, right? But at the end of the day, you're thinking about it like a finished good. It becomes a consumer good in and of itself in an organization. Anything that fits that criteria, that takes on a life of its own, acts like a data product, to me at least.
Right. And it seems like in the example you just shared, which I love, by the way, that map that gets used so often, it needs its own server. It sounds like it almost came to that company in a backwards way where they created the product and then it became a data product. It's sort of that shifted their mindset probably of like, oh, we should do this way. Are there steps that companies can follow so that they're more strategic in terms of how they actually approach that and make sure that the data products they are putting together are actual data products that are serving a consumer need?
Yeah, I mean, the first and foremost thing is to actually talk to the people that use it. So measure whether or not it's being used, and then talk to people who are using it and you go, hey, is this the right way to think about this problem? Or are you just taking the data and like we've made a very pretty chart and all you're doing is downloading the data behind it and doing something else with it, right? Like how are you actually using this information? What are the downstream impacts of that? And then you could think about how you can make it a better, more complete product. Like for them, they got used to showing sales data for years and years and years. What became way more interesting to them was like talking about market share instead, because if you're in a saturated industry, like knowing that, hey, we had higher sales in New York City than like Boise, Idaho, isn't that interesting actually. The thing that's interesting is what's the market share look like in those regions? And if you have that data, you can find undersaturated markets where you can go sell into those markets and I can actually move the lever here, right? But like all of that comes down to knowing what are they going to do with it and really understanding your consumer. And then again, your consumer knowing that you exist and can actually respond to their needs. And again, like that can mean you're creating APIs or documentation or frequently asked question pages or whatever. Like all those things are then based on what the consumer needs from a self-service perspective, then how they're going to use that information. But that's why I love the concept of data products. I don't want it to evolve into something else of like, oh, it has to be an API or it has to be monetized or anything. Because it's like more about adapting this mindset of like everything we do should be for the sake of the people who are going to use it.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm assuming you can't get very far in creating a data product without proper data quality in place, right? And we had a question from the audience on data quality. Let's see, it was from Jason. Thanks for your question, Jason. How do you approach groups or departments in an organization that have really poor data quality, and how do you make them understand the importance? And I guess if you can tie that into that whole data product mindset, that would be awesome.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can tackle this problem. But it's important to remember like data quality often data quality issues are most often a result of poor business processes. Sometimes it's like we messed up a technical implementation of something when we move data or when we, manipulate it in some way. More often than not, though, it's like, what are the required fields that you have in a business process to capture? How are you actually like pre-defining like what we call reference data, right? The stuff that you're going to curate ahead of time to say, how do we classify these things? How much of it is automated versus how much of it relies on human behavior, right?
Yeah.
If you think about it, right, like you're still trying to understand the consumer's needs. So a lot of times the people that use the data are the people that actually collect the data themselves. And so when they understand, like, here's the benefit of me taking a little bit extra time to do this extra step or to make sure this part's complete before we go through entering a record or something, that can help. But data quality ultimately starts with like a people problem first. Otherwise, you're kind of just like, you're dealing with a downstream output and trying to clean it up. It doesn't actually address the problem of quality itself. Like you have to go talk to people and learn about like why they're not capturing the data at a certain point. It could be like that could gum up a business process if they were to expect something at one point versus downstream, where it might come later on as an augmentation piece.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, like, just like you need to have a clear understanding of what your consumers are, you need to understand also like the collection aspects and the complexities of the business processes for that to be able to address that problem. And like, that's what makes data practitioners' lives really hard, is if it was just a technical problem, and a lot of us just like want it to be a technical problem because life is simpler that way. But like 99 times out of 100, you can solve the problem by going and talking to someone and trying to help affect change in the organization from the human side and trying to address that versus just like creating all these different fuzzy matching algorithms and complex scenarios to deal with data quality downstream.
I'm laughing because I definitely remember scenarios of, there was a big CRM tool we were using for a client, and the people entering the data simply did not have maybe proper data literacy, and they weren't really too sure where that data is going and how it's feeding into probably the most important dashboard of that entire company that runs the business. And all it really took was, I think people tried the technical approach of let's change these fields and make sure that they're mandatory and, slap them on the wrist if they don't do it. All it took was sort of a workshop session where we're like, okay, well, this is important because this number goes here and there and ends up here where the CEO is looking at it to make a decision. And then people are like, oh, okay, so that's important. Like, make sure we get that in and make it clear.
And whether it's data quality or data products or anything you're doing, right? It's always like starting with like, why are we doing this? And making sure that people are like brought into that conversation to know why they're doing something. That's like how you can treat someone in a very empathetic and human way, is to make sure they know, like, why is this important?
Yeah. And the last question here for you on data products, how easy is this to do? So if folks listening on the line here, they love the idea of the concept of data products. Is this something that's easy to convince everyone on your leadership team to shift your mindset? Because, it's really easy to get everyone to change their minds, right? Think like this from now on.
Yeah. You remember it was Jason that asked that question, right? So I think so many organizations have a technical and non-technical divide culturally, where for many reasons, right, and probably like a lot of really good stories of why it's the case, there's not a lot of trust. Cross-departmentally, or across the technical divide, or across the leadership divide, and that's a harder thing, right, to address. But again, I think it's asking a lot of technical practitioners too, and acknowledging that, right? But because oftentimes teams that work with data from a technical perspective sit in the middle, they have the best opportunity to help, like, mend those relationships by being very empathetic, by listening, by over communicating. Is it fair? No, but like, that's what makes the analytics profession really interesting. Is that it's ultimately like at least half a human exercise and half a technical exercise. And I think if you think about it first from a communication perspective and first from like a human need perspective, it can help you create better technical solutions too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think showcasing just sort of examples like what you explained today with the map example that you had for one of your clients, and showing them how it works and sort of the benefits of doing something like this, and saying it over and over again in every meeting, I think eventually drives home the point. All right, let's move on to data mesh. So data mesh, a decentralized approach that enables teams to create their own data products and share them with others. I think another good place to start is, what is data mesh? Can you explain it to those who have not heard of the term before?
Yeah, so before I give a definition, I'll give a little bit of background. So data mesh has really risen out of a fundamental failure on the front, a lot of the fronts that we've talked about, of organizations who've made a lot of promises and believed a lot of hype, frankly, and have a lot of unmet expectations for how data is being used and the return on investment that's been made in these organizations. It takes too long to get stuff out the door. You ask for something and it's like, well, it might come back in a few months. We'll see. When it actually comes back, sometimes it's really far removed from what they actually asked for in the first place, because the owners of the data and the consumers of the data are like miles apart within big, complex organizations. And again, if you're lacking ownership, it's not clear who you actually go talk to, have that data quality conversation with. So brilliant woman, Jaume Degani, proposed basically this concept of a data mesh as an answer to what many organizations tried to solve, that all those problems with a central team. Let's make it central so we all know we go to one place to get answer to data questions. But obviously, for many organizations, especially large, complex organizations, lots of M&A activity where you're like, we have 15 centralized teams. I have 4 EDWs. How do I have 4 enterprise data warehouses? How is that possible, right? What she did is say, okay, let's look at the challenges of centralization and decentralization and think about all the things we need to put in place so that socio-technically, like human and technology, is contemplated for how we can actually decentralize. Because decentralization has failed miserably in the past for like a bunch of different reasons, just like complete centralization has failed for many reasons as well. And so she wrote a couple blogs that got a ton of attention, ended up writing a book. Now she's doing a stealth startup. It's fun to watch her from afar. I don't know her personally, but importantly, right, when we talk about data mesh, it's not an architecture. It's not a particular technology. It's not something you can just buy off the shelf. It's really an organization being able to answer all of those questions and have an answer for basically how do we manage a fully decentralized model in our organization for delivering data and for domain ownership of that. That's the simplest way I can kind of.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you for that background. I think that's very helpful. In the beginning, you mentioned that sometimes you'll request something and it'll take 2 months to get something back. So I wanted to follow up on that and say, how long should it take? I know we all want instant, but ideally in this environment, how long should it take?
Yeah, I mean, we're consultants. So the joke is we always say it depends. That's the answer to every consulting question. But it's not helpful. So this is where data mesh is interesting, right? So if you're going to take a centralized team, you have to take the data out of wherever you're keeping it. You need to move it to somewhere, central platform. You need to do stuff to the data to make it ready for use. It gets served out to end users. Mm-hmm. What data mesh, in conceptualizing this, right? One of the principles is that it is decentralized, that you're delivering data products from a decentralized ownership model. So hopefully you're reducing the friction between the people that are creating the data and the people that are serving that data to the end users in that. So this is why data mesh sounds very attractive, right? Because you're saying we don't have to pipeline data. We don't have to rely on communicating requirements to central teams. We as a team can create data products that then serve to the organization and hopefully respond to that feedback faster and get those things out the door more quickly. I don't always see it play out that way, right? But ultimately, if you think about like an average life cycle of how we can actually produce data, we're pretty good at it. and to fully test something and roll it out for the particular use case you need, it's at least one sprint, oftentimes 2 sprints. And that typically means 2 to 4 weeks for something, just thinking about it from end to end, of taking profiling data from scratch, right? So the benefit is if you can get something that's mostly there and iterate on it, you can get that out the door faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for going through that. It would be great to hear from Patrick, Kevin, Christina, this next question. Data mesh, we've seen the benefits, we know what it is now, sort of, right? Thank you, Tony, for going through all that. I think most people have conceptualized what that actually is. Who is this for? Can every company listening right now, can they take advantage of the data mesh concept?
I see companies that are in acquisition mode that are onboarding disparate data systems, something that necessarily isn't inclined to having kind of a centralized data warehouse approach. I think those are kind of the use cases where this can be applicable. Whereas if it's something that's a little bit more standard repeatable, having kind of the central governed data warehouse approach is something that's still on the table. But if you're kind of looking into the future and it's basically, we're in acquisition mode, we're bringing on disparate entities that should probably exist in almost kind of like a mart concept, that would kind of be the road to applicability for data mesh from my standpoint. I don't know, Patrick or Christina, if you see it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see data mesh as starkly tied to or distinctly tethered to centralized versus decentralized. Perhaps in the way of thinking, centralized versus decentralized, but as far as the technology, to Tony's point, data mesh isn't a battery of technologies per se. So to that point, I don't see it personally, and this is in its infantile stage, of course, as you know, it's still being defined as we're talking right now. But my take on it now is it's not necessarily a hard line between centralized versus decentralized, unless you're talking about a way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think if you think about it through the lens, because even in the book and everything, right, Jean-Marc starts by saying, right, this is for large and complex organizations where central approaches are failing them effectively. Yeah. So implicit in that, right, like for many organizations, they think they're large and complex. They're not actually that large and complex. Okay. And they can make it harder by decentralizing, by spreading their technical teams out to the organization to provide that competency. They may not be at that inflection point where like we've maxed out on what we can achieve from a central perspective. And so I think you have to look at it first from like the problem set of like, what is your experience with your central team? And why do you think those challenges exist today? Because you can start down the road of getting some of the fundamentals in place to be able to prepare for a fully like by the book data mesh implementation without having to like restructure your whole organization overnight.
So I'm hoping this answer in mind, just to be clear, Torsten asked a really good question. You know, what in this context, I'll just abbreviate his question. He's talking about centralizing or decentralizing your data. This is a partially, and when I was talking about a warehouse versus not thing, I'm not talking, you can do a data mesh and still have your data in some of the processes centralized. It's thinking of it as a product or thinking about the whole thing is where the mesh comes in. So it's, hopefully, I think I may have butchered my first question, but I think I was trying to speak to Torsten's thing. Does anybody else have a take on Torsten's question?
I'll read it out just so you all hear it. So the question Torsten asks is, what are the main drivers for the decision if you decentralize your data or better to keep it centralized? Despite data mesh, decentralizing data products and organization, isn't it worth keeping centralized data regarding architecture, governance, and common reusable components that would support or should support all data products?
Yeah, and that's clear in the principles for data mesh. Is you're expecting there's going to be a self-service platform for discovering data products. You're going to have a federated computational governance model, meaning a lot of jargon, but meaning we're going to have standards for like what's an acceptable data product look like in terms of legal, compliance, quality, communication mechanisms with the teams that own those products. And then also like contemplating interoperability. And again, so if you're thinking about it from like, what are all the things that have caused decentralized models to fail in the past? Well, it's that everybody's doing their own thing and there's duplicate work everywhere and inconsistency in terms of those models and stuff. So standards is baked into it. And again, if you've only read a couple blogs on this, like it's really helpful to buy the book and read the whole book versus reading snippets from people, because otherwise you can get confused. Like, oh, if I buy such and such technology, I almost said one, and I'm glad I didn't. But if you buy such and such technology, like that solves my problem.
Yeah, that was my next question is, what are some of the first steps a company has to take, you know, if they're interested in implementing data mesh? And my theory was you're going to bring up the book. And is that step one, read the whole book cover to cover?
I don't think you need to. So to start. So again, we think a data product mindset is valuable, period. Centralized, decentralized, thinking about your consumer and having clear ownership of a product to a consumer is fundamental for delivering data analytics to people, period. The question is, when do you cross that threshold of now we have enough data products, we're going, oh crap, now we're having issues with standardization and how do people discovering these products, and you know, is ownership and that governance really clear or not, right?
Yeah.
Are we reaching a place of complexity where the inflection point of our productivity is going down? So in that, right, it's like even in your central teams, we have the same thing. Christina says this all the time, right? But like clearly defining your standards for governance and interoperability and like what you're actually creating from a central team before you push it out to the organization. If you can't figure it out within a small group building central, it's going to be hard to control that as it goes wide. And then ownership and stewardship. So is it clear who you call when you have an issue? And again, those are all things that are just fundamentals for data. Data mesh takes it to the next level to say, how do you do that in a large, complex organization? But you don't need to do a data mesh to put in data governance. That's not a requirement.
Right. And Tony, early on, you mentioned the word standards. And Torsten had a follow-up question on that. Is there someone who's working on these standards? Are these standards that every company is writing for themselves? Is this by industry? Where are these standards?
So for sure by industry, there's different industry model concepts that are out there that are public. There's like data models for oil and gas and stuff. In other industries, they have standard models. But this is like, I think, I don't know her personally, but this is probably why Zhamak has started a stealth startup also, is to define it. This is early stage, like Patrick said.
Yeah.
The data mesh book does go through like what she has seen as necessary standards for that. And it's very helpful to read that and go, okay, yeah. And she's published some of that like publicly on the blog too. So it's not like you have to buy the book to know that. But I mean, you need to contemplate how to connect disparate data products together. And that leads to all kinds of questions of like, well, what's that framework look like? And what does the framework providing feedback look like to data governance teams? And what does security policies look like? And how do we enforce those? You know, so the data mesh book kind of opens the door to say, here's the answer to this problem, but it doesn't go into the detailed answer to say, this is the solution. How do we do this in every scenario? That's still being worked on and being worked out. And I think it's one of the challenges and one of the cautions I'd have for people is before you go that route, you need to be ready that you're entering into a very difficult process of having to define those standards, potentially mostly from scratch for your organization. There are stuff that's available publicly, but you're still gonna have to compile that together and package it and figure out how it applies to your particular problems.
But you don't necessarily have to do it alone, right? You can work with consulting companies.
Well, yeah.
Analytics 8, for example, just who can basically hold your hand throughout the process and who've seen others build these frameworks and standards. I know it's early days, but
this is also where like meetups are really important, and industry communities, and like talking to peers and having places like communities you're creating where people can come together and talk about common challenges they're having too. Like LinkedIn's become a great place for that too publicly.
Absolutely.
You have to buy consultancies to engage in those communities. We think we add value for sure, but like I think it's important that the social community, we kind of rise this up together to say, this is working, this isn't working, versus becoming very dogmatic about like, oh, I'm a data mesh person. It's like, okay. I mean, I'm caring much more about like, how do we make this organization successful? And it may be partly this and partly something else that we're going to blend together.
Right. All right. Thank you for that, Tony. Let's move on to event-driven architecture. So like a conductor of an orchestra, which helps all different instruments work in harmony, right? Event-driven architecture uses event messages to trigger and communicate tasks between decoupled services to ensure everything is running smoothly. So Patrick, I think let's start again here with a definition. What is event-driven architecture?
Got you. Well, I don't know if you were trying to be poetic or not, but with that description of what it is, it's interesting. It's kind of funny that event-driven architecture is a subject in the realm of what's called orchestration. And orchestration is getting all these pieces to talk together. Some people will mistakenly substitute the word automation, but it's not. Some things, if you think about things as a spectrum here, and we talk about making all the pieces talk together, you can have something completely manual. And that's maybe perfect for R&D purposes. Like you want to kick off this data load, and then you want to refresh this dashboard. You want to have records fall out that you manually doctor. While you're trying to really get your arms around things, completely manual is maybe perfectly acceptable. On the total opposite end of the spectrum is everything is automated. And this is where event-driven architectures come into place. Is those foster a completely automated architecture environment. So I think probably to explain event-based architectures, one is try to give a real cursory definition and then talk about what it's replacing. So if we think about event-based architectures as a component of a fully automated or partially automated environment, it is doing something based upon some sort of external stimulus. Mm-hmm. This thing happened, therefore now it's time to do this. Or this thing happened, now a bunch of things need to happen. And when those are done, these things keep cascading, from event to event to event to event. If we contrast that to what we've done historically in our industry and in orchestration, we've often done things on a schedule, or we've done things when we were polling. So did this happen? Yes or no? Okay, if it did happen, then let's do this. But it's based, we used to poll, and wait for and look for something to happen. Whereas in an event-based architecture, you're sitting there and waiting and listening for something to happen. Mm-hmm. So this is more popular now because the cloud of the technologies in the cloud, they better foster a thing for us to both, for technologies to both emit events as well as listen and consume events. So that's why this is becoming more and more popular. But it's definitely not a new concept. I mean, that's the way we think. And I think maybe I'll park that now, because I think there's some questions that we probably ask about why we're doing this now. But I'll pretend not to read your mind, and let's go ahead and go.
Well, yeah, a follow-up question I had, it was similar to the question I had around data mesh, right? So event-driven architecture seems like it solves some problems, but again, is this for every type of company? Is there a certain size or data analytics maturity that a company has to be in to take advantage of this?
No, I mean, it's absolutely not. I mean, we can see the smallest of companies. And in fact, some of our smallest companies that we work with are the quickest to adopt this approach. Partially because they don't have a lot of technical debt, partially because they didn't start their data analytics journey with on-prem systems, and they're in their journey of trying to move things to the cloud. Yeah. So no, I mean, again, I maybe a few specific examples would help here. So
yeah, absolutely.
If we think about in the data analytics world, when new data is made available, one system will emit an event to say, hey, I've got new data for you. There's a bunch of other things that are listening for this event, saying, hey, I'm listening for new customer data to be available. At this point, I know I can go retrieve it, I can go consume it. And then when that's done, that can kick off another event that says, all right, now it's time to transform it. Now it's time to do whatever transformations we need, which could kick off another event and says, okay, dashboards, I need to refresh. So that's a pretty simple but very, very realistic example. Right. It explains why it really doesn't matter if you're big or small. It's really just, it's when you're ready to take the leap.
Okay, and then are we assuming that all the data is in the cloud for companies to take advantage of this, or can some stuff be on-prem?
Well, it definitely can be on-prem, but that's, I think, being in the cloud makes it more conducive to this. Because the concept of events is not new at all, but the ability to both emit events and listen for events and process them is way easier in the cloud. If we think about a lot of the data sources these days, a lot of the data sources themselves are cloud-based. A lot of the things that are receiving these and orchestrating are also cloud-based.
Mm-hmm. Are there any downsides to this approach? Like, does it get too complicated if you maybe start before you're ready?
Well, I mean, a downside is I think a lot of people think, all right, this is a trend and I'm hearing about it. This is, I have to do it. You know, I'm a big believer in if it ain't broken, don't fix it. You know, if you've had a data load that's working flawlessly for a decade, let's not mess with it just for the sake of doing it. Now, if there are issues that are happening, and issues can come in many forms, like if there are issues that you having, then you can consider like, all right, let me try moving some of this orchestration pieces, moving some of them to be event-based. Again, this is not an all or nothing thing. I mean, we can have some parts of orchestration be automated via events, some sort of parts of the orchestration being automated by polling, by scheduling, and we can actually have some of them still remain manual. Like all these things can happen together.
Okay, so it's not an either or. Before we move on to the next topic, does anyone else on the panel want to add anything on event-driven architecture?
I think it's just super use case driven. I don't think it's necessarily, like Patrick said, it's not one organization size fits all. I mean, just really look at the use case. And that's really going to define whether or not it's something that you want to adopt or whether or not you're basically fine subsisting on scheduled reloads or doing kind of daily batch reload intervals. So, I mean, that's kind of my only takeaway from it, having worked with it before a little bit.
All right.
One last thing, I know we're running out of time, but I just kind of, why is this now? If I said events are not new, the concept of them, and the cloud's certainly not brand new, why is this a trend now? Well, I think this is at a point now in people's evolution to the cloud. So turn the clock back like 5 years, that's when we saw the big rush in earnest, not rush, but the big movement in earnest for data and analytic workflows to go from on-prem to the cloud. That was step one, but that was basically just a lift and shift, put a server room from a closet or from a basement into some virtual server room in the sky. Now, I think from once we went the next main wave to go more cloud native was to do things serverless. And we saw a lot of people doing that. And now that we're serverless, the next main thing to do to become more cloudy is to move to things that are more event driven and more cloud reason. If we had more time, I could probably spend a whole hour talking about this, but
I'm sure we could talk for an hour for each of these trends, but we are trying to cover 5. We have 1 left, and then we are still going to take questions from the audience. So quick reminder there, guys, make sure you type in those questions and comments. So we're moving on to industrialized machine learning, which is the process of industrializing the development and deployment of machine learning models to make them more efficient and cost-effective for organizations. So Kevin, I'd love to hear from you. What problems does industrialized machine learning actually solve for companies?
Sure. And just to kind of level set, I can tell you that it is a McKinsey term. It is synonymous with ML ops for everybody out there in the audience if you're kind of looking for a corollary. But effectively, it's solving the question of how do I get my model to production systems in a reliable, efficient manner in which they're not going to fall down post-production launch. Really, if you want to boil it down to its core, it's a means and a framework to get your machine learning models into production.
All right. So why do we need this? Why is the old way not working? Why can't we just build machine learning models here and there and sort of do whatever we want?
I think it's a difference in terms of mindset. So a lot of the data science projects that you typically encountered were kind of siloed entities. It's basically somebody building a lot of Python code within a Jupyter notebook, something that's not necessarily built to scale across the organization. It might be good for a one-time use case. But it's not necessarily thinking in mind to the future as that model scales and as that model degrades over time once you actually put it into production. So that's why I think it's a really important concept today, because it definitely recognizes the importance of machine learning models in advanced analytics use cases, but also the need to support them long-term in a manner in which you can continuously monitor the solutions.
Right. And I guess my next question is, what do we need in order to set this up? Do we need really smart people? Do we need special tools, technology in order to make this work?
I think there has to be a certain level of technical maturity that exists within the organization. I mean, you're leveraging concepts of machine learning, DevOps, data engineering. So it's not necessarily something that can be spun up overnight if those technical competencies don't necessarily exist currently in your organization. But if you're looking at kind of like a minimal viable criteria in order to adopt, it would basically be, from my perspective, strong data process flows already established in the form of ingestion, replication, and transformation layers within your data stack. And then familiarity with CI/CD workflows, and then obviously machine learning competency, familiarity in order to build the models themselves.
We have to know machine learning to do this? What?
you
Awesome.
can, there are automated tools out there too that you can leverage.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for us to quickly walk through an example of a company that has set this up successfully and maybe talk about the process of how they actually set this up and what their results look like.
So I think one example that comes to mind is a customer of ours in which the project work really started as a proof of concept. So it's basically specific to predicting recruitment of medical funds. That first example that I referenced, that's how we did it initially. We built everything in Python within a Jupyter notebook. We outputted the result set. We integrated it into the front-end analytics and reporting tool. It had a lot of value, but it was a singular use case. It was a point-in-time use case, right? So if they wanted to expand upon it, if they wanted to kind of use it long-term in production, more had to be built in terms of process structure. So again, this was a proof of concept. Second phase of the project was effectively operationalizing it. So basically, what we did was take the basis of the model that we had built in that Jupyter notebook, leveraging Snowpark to basically automate the whole process, build in monitoring pipeline, so we could basically see post-production if that model was degrading, if there was any sort of A/B unit testing that we could implement in there. Basically, we wanted to make sure that we had a mechanism to basically view the model post-production to ensure that it was continually running, that it was outputting the results that we expected, and that there was no confusion on the front end since it was being integrated into front-end analytics dashboard and reporting. So I think that would be a really good example of kind of starting out from a proof of concept phase, kind of in a siloed manner, to a fully automated solution where we have methods, frameworks to basically view the performance of the model post-production, because that's really what we're driving at here with this concept. Yeah. Machine learning is nothing new, but it's effectively a framework to make sure that when you're pushing models to production, that we can continuously maintain, monitor the efficiency of them and make sure that it's something that's going to be used long-term and not just a science fair project.
Right, right. And is that model that you're referring to, is it still running smoothly as we speak?
Yeah. We check in with the customer just to make sure. Obviously, once we wrapped up the project, they kind of maintained it ongoing. But it is something that's definitely running smoothly. It's something that they've found a lot of value in. And that's kind of a unique project in the sense of kind of evolving from just a point-in-time use case specific to machine learning to something that's a little bit more fully baked out in terms of processes and just with an eye towards scalability and longevity.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Kevin. It seems like there's a common thread amongst all of these key trends that we're discussing, and that thread is mindset. So it's all about making sure you're in the right mindset for this year to take advantage of all of these opportunities. We spoke about a lot of great topics here, and I'd love to just go around the room. And in the beginning, you mentioned that there were some maybe trends that didn't make the cut for the top 5. So wanted to hear what's missing here. And I'd also love to hear from the live audience that joined, type that into the chat or the Q&A. Just let us know what you're thinking. What are we missing from these top 5? Obviously, we couldn't talk about it all in the 55 minutes that we spent here today. So let's go ahead and start with Christina. What other trend do you think people should care about this year?
Yeah, it's kind of related to the data literacy one and also a bit to the data mesh one, but it would be data catalogs. So we've got some really interesting data governance tools on the market today. And the reason I think it's going to be a trend this year is because we work a lot with our customers on data strategy and kind of helping them evaluate where they are today and where they want to go. And one of the really common themes that we hear across customers in all industries when we start interviewing people in different departments is that this lack of transparency to what data is even available to them. So like we were talking about with data literacy, we have all this great companies have great data, they have great tools now, but if they don't, from a data literacy point of view, if they don't know how to use that data to make informed business decisions, then we're not achieving our goal. And likewise, if they don't know the data is there or where to access it or have any kind of confidence in like, what is it? Like, what was the lineage for it? They're not going to use it, or they may not use it appropriately, which could be even worse. So I think that, using a data governance tool or data catalog tool might not always be the right fit for each customer, depending on where they are in their maturity and journey. But it's a great option that I think more and more customers are going to start embracing in an effort to kind of bridge that last gap that they're missing to get the business outcomes from all this great work that we're doing on the technical and back end side.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Let's move over to Patrick.
Sure. So I think something that we see a lot in our customers and we see hear people talking about a lot is, maybe they won't use these words, but it's getting past our sophomore phase in our release process of data analytics workloads. So more specifically, we are actually true engineers in data analytics. It's not just a title. We're building things. A lot of the things are steeped in and should have been all along in traditional CI/CD and software development rollout. So CI/CD means continuous integration, continuous development. It's a fancy way of saying, let's be more pragmatic and more disciplined in the way we roll out things. Let's be more disciplined in our change management and code control, code reviews, unit tests, user tests. Now's the time to not just start throwing stuff out to production. Let's be very diligent about it and be like we have, and apply the same principles that we have to other software development. Now apply those same things to data analytics workloads.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Let's move on to Tony.
So very briefly, it probably opens a can of worms, but happy to talk about it after with anybody who's interested. But the trend I'm watching this year is as organizations start to tighten their belts, some organizations start to tighten their belts, we're really going to test the limits of the openness of the data lakehouse paradigm. There's been a lot of promises made around that particular way of doing things, which we love. It's a great way to think about things. But one of the primary things about the lakehouse is that it's open, and then you can move away from proprietary processing to more open source or other alternative options. And as organizations look to tighten their belt, how open really is the data lakehouse, and where are the limitations on that, where we need to get better as an industry, as an entire data analytics industry around openness from the lakehouse paradigm.
Thank you, Tony. And Kevin, what do you wish we talked about today?
I think mine's a little bit more fluid, but it's basically the idea of data sharing in kind of a governed and sustained manner. So, a common trend in reporting and analytics is you build a governed dashboard, somebody looks at it, they basically export all the data out into Excel, do their own independent analysis. So what I see coming are mechanisms being built to kind of facilitate governed sharing of underlying data sets for consumption for users in terms of analysis. So you already see today things like Power BI data marts, Snowflake Marketplace, the rise of Sigma is kind of a direct discovery BI tool. I think that you're likely to see more of this as people are becoming more data literate. They become more comfortable with kind of going through their own self-exploration and having mechanisms kind of coming to the marketplace that really kind of help to facilitate that.
I actually agree. If I were to add one, it would probably be the true self-service, where you're using, anyone can use a tool and type in a question or ask a question using your voice and actually getting a data answer. But you do have to be data literate for that one, right? You have to know what you're asking.
Yeah, we actually had a question into the chat earlier about that. That was actually really good.
Yes. I do worry that we are at time here. I know we could probably spend another couple of hours talking about all of these topics, but I do want to thank the panelists for taking the time to share your insights. I don't see them as just trends. I see this as really what people should actually care about, changing their mindset, taking action. And I think you've given folks plenty to think about here today. and also encourage people to click on all the links in the chat. I think they're all very helpful. Go ahead and get some deeper learning in this week. And also follow Analytics 8 on LinkedIn. I've been following them. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I think they post great content. So thank you so much, Jen. I'm gonna hand this back over to you.
Sure thing. I will make this brief. I think we have several people holding on for the trivia question here. So first person to answer correctly gets a Analytics 8 drink tumbler. So of the 5 trends we discussed today, there's one that you need to have in place before any of the others, for any of the others to be effective. Which of those 5 is that trend / topic? We talked.
Oh, should we remind them what the trends were?
I was about to do it.
Okay, go ahead.
Data products, data mesh, event-driven architecture, industrialized machine learning, and data literacy. So one of those is fundamental to everything else. I can play
lots of options coming in.
Oh, is it? Where is it? Where is it?
So it's in the Q&A. We've got literacy, data literacy, data lineage.
Okay, the person who said data literacy is correct, and that is Tony Bustos. So Tony will get in touch with you after this.
Congratulations
for joining. Obviously, we could spend a ton more time talking about this. Feel free to reach out to any of the panelists individually. And we will be reaching out to everyone with an email, with a recording. You can find our newsletter, sign up on our website. We send a great email once a month. So sign up there, and we appreciate everyone for joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.